So Austin and I were just talking about chapter 3, and so if you're getting confused with chapter 3, what you should know is there's think of it like a split screen for like if you were watching a movie and you saw the world controller talking to the students and then cut to Lennon and Fanny, and then there's a cut to Bernard and Henry, and then Bernard and some of the other characters. So the reason it does this, of course, you have the garden. This starts out with the garden chapter, right? And so it's kind of an ironic Garden of Eden, and of course, this is all about the creation of what this society, the world state, and we get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, right? And so kind of think of those split screens. He's explaining society, and then we see it played out in those characters. So if you don't have, right, if you don't have history and literature, what do you have? Well, you have the feelies. If you don't have family and mothers and homes, what do you have? Then you have a pregnancy substitute, which is just a bunch of hormones and chemicals like medication instead. In order to have stability, what are you sacrificing? So that's kind of where we're at. We're about halfway through. If you'd like to join us, we are at the point where Lennon and Fanny are talking about they're talking about Henry Foster, and Lennon wants to be exclusive with Henry Foster, and Fanny is reprimanding her because in their society they're supposed to be, promiscuous, and of course she's feeling like she wants to be monogamous. And so one of the answers to that, you can say, is just a hypnopaetic phrase that ends the conversation, right? Everyone belongs to everyone else. And that kind of that ends the conversation. There's no more, because that's an accepted truth. It's a moral teaching. It's one of those hypnopaetic phrases. Okay, so we're actually on page 44, and it says the blood surrogate pump, and that's where I'm starting. So if you want to start there, you can. The blood surrogate pumped unceasingly turns its 800 revolutions a minute. The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its commission. Shorten that interval, break down all those old unnecessary boundaries. Fortunate boy, said the controller. No pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you so far that it is possible from having any emotions at all. Ford's in his flivver, murmured the DHC. All is well with the world. Cut to Lenny in a crown. Lennon in a crown, says Henry Foster, echoing the assistant predestinator's question as he zips up his trousers. Oh, she's a splendid girl. Wonderfully pneumatic. I'm surprised you haven't had her. Pneumatic means, if you look up the definition, full of air, but of course here it's kind of referring to like voluptuous or like, I don't know, attractive, something along those lines. I can't think of it how it is that I haven't, said the assistant predestinator. I certainly will, at the first opportunity. From his place on the opposite side of the changing room aisle, Bernard Marx overheard what they were saying and turned pale. To tell the truth, said Lenina, I'm beginning to get a tiny bit bored with nothing but Henry every day. She pulled over her left stocking. Do you know Bernard Marx? She asked in a tone whose excessive callousness was evidently forced. Fanny looked startled. You don't mean to say. Why not? Bernard's an Alpha Plus. Besides, he asked me to go to one of the Savage reservations with him. I've always wanted to see a Savage reservation. But his reputation. What do I care about his reputation? They say he doesn't like obstacle golf. They say, mocked Lenina. And then he spends most of his time by himself, alone. There was horror in Fanny's voice. Well, he won't be alone when he's with me. And anyhow, why are people so beastly to him? I think he's rather sweet. She smiled to herself, how absurdly she had been. Frightened almost, as though she were a world controller and he a gamma-minus machine minder. Consider your own life, said Mustafa Man. Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle? The question was answered by negative silence. So now we're back to the DHC and the Mustafa Man. Have any of you been compelled to live through a long time interval between the consciousness of a desire and its fulfillment? Well, began one of the boys and hesitated. Speak up, said the DHC. Don't keep his Fordship waiting. I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her. And you felt it, a strong emotion in the consequence? Horrible. Horrible, precisely, said the controller. Our ancestors were so stupid and so short-sighted that when the first reformers came along and offered to deliver them from these horrible emotions, they wouldn't have anything to do with them. Talking about her as though she were a bit of meat, so we're cutting over to Bernard now. Bernard ground his teeth. Have her there, like mutton. Degraded her to so much mutton. And she'd think it over and she'd say, give me the answer this week. Oh, Ford, oh, Ford. He would have liked to go up to them and hit them in the face hard. Yes, I really do advise you to have her, Henry Foster was saying. Take ectogenics. Pfitzner and Kogarachi had the whole technique worked out, but would the governments look at it? No. There was something called Christianity. Women were going on being viviparous. And that means to obviously be monogamous, right? Or to have a relationship with just two people. He's so ugly, said Fanny, but I rather like the way he looks. And then so small. Fanny made a grimace. Smallness was horribly and typically lower caste. I think it's rather sweet, said Lenina. One feels like you would pet him, like a cat. Fanny was shocked. They say somebody made a mistake when he was in the bottle and thought he was a gamma and put alcohol in his blood surrogate, and that's why he stunted. What nonsense, Lenina was indignant. Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England, and this is back to the DHC and World Controller. Something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The record survives. Speeches out of liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient, miserable. Freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. But my dear chap, you're welcome. I have assured you. You're welcome. Back to Henry Foster in that conversation. In the assistant predestinator on the shoulder. Everyone belongs to everyone else after all. 101 repetitions a night, 3 times a week for 4 years, thought Bernard Marx, who was a specialist on hypnopaedia. 62,400 repetition make one truth, idiots. So what we realize here is Bernard Marx, he's an alpha plus, but he also understands like what's going on in terms of, he's a psychologist in the society, so he creates these hypnopaedic phrases and he's aware of how they're being manipulated and used. So maybe he has like kind of that, that outsider view or insider view, but also sees himself as not connected then with the society, so feels outside of it. Or the caste system, constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy, as though men were more than physiochemically equal. Well, all I can say is I'm going to accept his invitation. That's Lenina. Bernard hated them, but they were two. They were large, they were strong. Then we're back to the DHC. The 9 Years' War began in AF 141. Not even if it were true about the alcohol in his blood surrogate. Physogene, chlorophenin, ethanol, isoacetate. Oh boy. Anyway, lots of chemicals. Not to mention hydrocyanic acid, which I simply don't believe, Lenina concluded. The noise of 14,000 aeroplanes advancing in open order, but in Kurnovstum and in the 8th arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bomb is hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag. So he's referring to the year that they have this huge war, right, and everything changes and they're able to establish a new government. Because I do want to see a savage reservation. So that's Lenina, and she's talking about Bernard has asked her to go to a savage reservation. So what is a savage reservation? We should probably keep that in mind, yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, what? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh, mucus, a foot, a bone, flying through the air, landing, flop in the middle of geraniums, the scarlet ones, splendid. What a show that summer. So that's the war again he's talking about, that the DHC and the World Controller are talking about. You're hopeless, Lenina. I give you up. That's what Fanny is saying to Lenina. The Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious. DHC, that's the DHC and World Controller. Turned to back, Fanny and Lenina continued their changing in silence. The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse. There was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and... Fanny Crown's a nice girl too, said the assistant predestinator. That's Henry Foster, and that whole conversation. In the nurseries, the elementary class consciousness lesson was over. The voices were adapting future demand on future industrial supply. I do love flying, they whispered. I do love flying. I do love having new clothes. I do love... Liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax, but all at the same time, you couldn't do things by force. That's back to the DHC and World Controller. Not nearly so pneumatic as Lenina. Oh, not nearly. But old clothes are beastly, continued. And so now this is another split screen, and so he's introducing another one, and this is back to the children who are being hypnopaedic, sleep taught at the same time. So you can notice the society, right, the speeding up, especially with the current history, and so how fast-paced society is. And we'll get more on that in a little bit. Government's an affair of sitting and not hitting. You rule with the brains and the buttocks and never with the fists. For example, there was a conscription of consumption. There, I'm ready, said Lenina, but Fanny remained speechless and averted. Let's make peace, Fanny, darling. Every man, woman, and child compelled to consume. so much in a year in the interest of industry, the sole result. So it was a huge push from the government for people to consume, meaning buy more stuff, right? So they could produce more so that the economy would function better. Ending is better than mending. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches, so that's another hypnopaetic phrase. One of these days, said Fanny with a dismal emphasis, you'll get in trouble. Conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume and back to nature. So there was indeed a pushback after the war, and then after they're trying to establish this and like push consumption, right? People had what is called conscientious objection. They just didn't do what they were supposed to, even though it may have been law. I do love flying. Back to culture, yes. Actually, to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. Do I look all right? Lenina asked. Her jacket was made of bottle green acetate with green viscose fur at the cuffs and the collar. She is a beta, but this is like a really deep green, even though she's supposed to be wearing mulberry. So I'm guessing that some of the betas, like the women betas, were able to be like stylish and kind of choose their own clothing. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns, Golder's green. So the objectors were killed. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Green corduroy shorts and a white viscose woolen stocking turned down at the knee. Then came the British Museum massacre. 2,000 cultures fans gassed with sulfide, and the green and white jockey cap shaded Lenina's eyes. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. In the end, said Mustafa-Man, the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but indefinitely surer methods of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopaedia. So if you're familiar with the Pavlovian dog, remember the Pavlovian Conditioning Center? Do you guys know that? Pavlovian dog? Have you heard of that?
I don't remember it.
No? Okay, so Pavlov's dog theory was that every time the bell rings and you give a dog a treat, right? Yeah, and so you can be conditioned, right? Behaviorally conditioned. In order to behave a certain way. It's like when the bell rings at school, you all get up, right? That's Pavlov's dog. That's Pavlovian theory. Okay. In the end, said Mustafa, and round her waist she wore a silver-mounted green Moroccan surrogate cartridge belt, bulging, for Lenina was not a free Martian. With the regulation of supply of contraceptives, the discoveries of Pfizer and Kagauchi were the last made use of, the intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction. Perfect, cried Fanny enthusiastically. She could never resist Lenina's charm for long. And what perfectly sweet Matthelusian belt, accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, blowing up of historical monuments, luckily most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' War, and by the suppression of all books published before AF 150. I simply must get one like it, said Fanny. And there were some things called pyramids, for example. My old black patent bandolier. And a man called Shakespeare. You've never heard of them, of course. It's an absolute disgrace, that bandolier of mine. Okay, so these are constant cuts, if you can follow those. Such are the advantages of really scientific education. The more stitches, the less riches, and the more stitches, the less. The introduction of our Ford's Model T. I've had it nearly 3 months. Chosen as the opening date of the new era. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than... There was a thing, as I've said before, called Christianity. Ending is better than mending. The ethics of philosophy of underconsumption. I love new clothes. I love new clothes. I love so essential when they were under production, but in the age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen, positively a crime against society. Henry Foster gave it to me. All crossed their tops. All had their crosses. All crosses had their tops cut and became T's. There was also this thing called God. It's a real Morocco surrogate. We have the world state now and the Ford Day celebrations and community sings and solidarity service. Oh, Ford, how I hate them, Bernard Marx was thinking. Yeah, so in the world state, so they celebrate Ford, right? They have replaced religion by community sings and solidarity services. And we'll get to see a solidarity service. It's quite odd. There was a thing called heaven, but they all the same, they used to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. Like meat, like so much meat. And there was a thing called the soul and a thing called immorality. Do ask Henry where he got it. But they used to take morphia and cocaine, and what makes it worse, she thinks of herself as meat. 2,000 pharmaceutical and biochemists were subsidized in AF 178. He does look glum, said the assistant predestinator, pointing at Bernard Marx. 6 years later, it was being produced commercially, the perfect drug. Let's bait him. Euphoric, narcotic, and pleasantly hallucinant. Glum Marks, glum, clap on the shoulder to make him look up. It was the brute, Henry Foster. What you need is a gram of soma. All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, but none of their defects. Ford, I should like to kill him, but all he did was say, no thank you, and fend off the pre-offered tube of tablets. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like, and come back with so much of a headache or a mythology. Take it, insisted Henry Foster. Take it. Stability was practically assured. 1 cubic centimeter cures 10 gloomy sentiments, said the assistant predestinator, citing a piece of homely hypnopaetic wisdom. It's only a reminder to conquer old age. Damn you, shouted Bernard Marx. Hoity-toity. Hormones, transfusion of young blood, magnesium salts. And do remember that a gram is better than a damn, they went out laughing. All of the physiological stigmata of the old age have been abolished, and along with them, of course. Don't forget to ask him about that Mathelusian belt, said Fanny. Along with them, all of old man's mental peculiarities. Characters remain constant throughout a whole lifetime. 2 rounds of obstacle golf to get through before dark. I must fly. Work, play, at 60 our powers and tastes are what they are at 17. Old men in the bad old days used to renounce, retire, take to religion, spend their time reading, thinking. Idiots. Swine, Bernard Marx was saying to himself as he walked down the corridor to the left. Now such is progress. The old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have time. No leisure from pleasure. Not a moment to sit down and think, or if ever by some unlucky chance such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there is always soma, delicious soma. Half a gram for half a holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous east, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning whenever they find themselves on the other side of a crevice, safe on solid ground of daily labor and distraction, scampering from feeling to feeling, feely to feely, from girl to girl, from girl to pneumatic girl, from the electromagnetic golf course to... Go away, little girl, shouted the DHC angrily. Go away, little boy. Can't you see his 4 chips busy? Go and do your erotic play somewhere else. Suffer the little children, said the controller. And of course that's a biblical reference. Slowly and majestically, in the faint humming of machinery, the conveyors moved forward 33 centimeters an hour. In the red darkness glinted the innumerable rubies. So that takes us back to the very beginning when we saw kind of that factory where life is created. Yeah, so that chapter is really difficult, and hopefully this was a little bit helpful in understanding like the split screens and why he sped the narrative pace like he did. So he's really speeding up the narrative pace because life is so fast there. All right, so thanks for listening. We'll catch you for chapters 4 and 5 later.